Thank you all for joining us today at the Catholic Information Center. We're very pleased to have you here on Ash Wednesday, a very important day as we start the journey of Lent toward Easter, but also a time for us to join our Holy Father in prayer, considering the recent news of his resignation at the end of this month. So we're so thankful to have you here to join us in this time of penance and prayer to keep our Holy Father in mind. And so we've invited some Catholic scholars here to join us today to discuss this news of our Holy Father's resignation at the end of this month that surprised all of us, and many have said has added to the many surprises that he brought to his time as Pope. So without further ado, I'll introduce Kathryn Jean Lopez, who is going to help moderate the discussion today, and she'll introduce the rest of our speakers. Kathryn is editor-at-large of National Review Online. Anybody here in Washington who's a Catholic knows or reads Kathryn Lopez. She's also co-director of Catholic Voices USA, who we're very thankful to join us in sponsoring this event. Catholic Voices USA, if you haven't checked them out yet, you should online. It's the United States version of a successful group in the UK that brings Catholic voices to this public square in a new and excellent way, bringing them to the media to speak out on issues such as these and other issues that we need more Catholic voices speaking on. So, and then joining her are Mary Rice Hasson, Stephen White, both of whom are fellows at nearby in a Catholic Studies program at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and Father Justin Huber. And so I'll pass the microphone. Please join me in welcoming Kathryn Lopez and
Thank you all for coming at 4 o'clock on Ash Wednesday. I imagine you had other things you could be doing. But we also thought it was important to do something like this because as we were sharing earlier, it seems like obviously we were all surprised and shocked on Monday, but I keep encountering people who are more shocked as the days go on. And so I get the sense people want to have a conversation about this and what it means, and so here we are. Maybe I'll start with the, well, let me start with Father Huber. How's that?
I think I'm in the wrong place. I was just here to get ashes. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. Well, no, and it is great to be here, and I want to thank Mary Rose for scheduling this at 4 o'clock so that I can plug confession and mass this evening. Night is on for you going to confession and mass this evening.
What time at Holy Redeemer?
We're doing a Holy Redeemer at 6:30, so and then mass at 7:30. So we always have to shamelessly plug our products.
And I think we have St. Matthew's at 5:30.
That's
and
right.
We can print out a list if we
No, I guess the approach I'd like to sort of take with this, I know we're each going to kind of address this from different angles. Since I'm the priest, I have to talk about virtue, and I'd like to just sort of talk about this as sort of an act of heroic virtue. You know, here we see this man who is entrusted with this great charge, and there are some who are going to see this, unfortunately, they're going to be opportunistically seeing this as a sort of walking away from this great charge. And I think quite the opposite is happening. I think that what we've seen here is a man who is really, Pope Benedict, who has really sort of sought to discern the Lord's will, and really is acting with this heroic virtue, stepping aside from what could be a certain temptation to kind of hold on to this task, even though he doesn't necessarily feel up to it. You know, sometimes the old adage, discretion is the better part of valor. And so I think in a sense he's, in some ways Benedict is very much a traditional man. He's very much part of the tradition of the faith, but he's also been a trailblazer in certain ways. You know, we've seen him kind of creating a modern papacy. You know, we saw him revamp some of the titles that the successor to St. Peter uses out of respect for the East. We also saw him eliminate the tiara from the papal coat of arms. And here he may be setting forth a sort of a new paradigm for popes of the future. I mean, who knows, really? But you know, he may be setting forth a new paradigm to say, you know what? Sometimes it can be heroic to actually step down when you admit that you can no longer fulfill the duties at hand, you know, rather than holding on out of pride, perhaps, to a task. And so I really kind of see this as an act of heroic virtue on his part. Somebody had an interesting take. I forget who it was. One of the commentators said, well, you know, what a great thing it is stepping away from all that power. And I guess you could read it in that way, you know. I mean, perhaps it's that, but I suspect he probably doesn't see it in that way.
But the rest of the world, I mean, I think that's why it doesn't compute with a lot of people, right? Because you're the Pope. Why would you give that up?
And if that is the case, well, that's heroic virtue too. So either way, I'm going to go with my thesis. So,
do you agree with that, Stephen? And let me ask too. If you go back and read the Peter Sewall interview book, A Light of the World, a couple of years ago, he of course talks about, as people commented on when they were waiting for something to say on Monday, he talked about the possibility of resigning. And he said in 2012, well, I obviously couldn't do it now. You know, it would look like I was running away. I'm paraphrasing. What makes now different?
Well, it doesn't seem that there's any sort of anything immediate that precipitated this, or any immediate concern that precipitated this. I think the timing, I was looking out the window that our offices look over St. Matthew's Cathedral, and it's always busy at the 12:10 Mass on Ash Wednesday, especially when the Cardinals has the Mass. But it was really, really crowded. I've never seen it that crowded. The lines down the block in the direction waiting to get in for the next Mass. I'm not the first to observe this, but I think there's the fact that he announced this on Monday of the week when Lent starts is significant. We should have a new Pope by Easter. And so the Church will be starting sort of on the next pontificate, right, as we're starting the holiest of our holy seasons. So I think that probably had something to do with the timing. As you mentioned, there were indications that something like this might be afoot. Not only had he said something, but there were other things. It turns out that his new accommodations, which will be most likely in this building, it's a small monastery in the back gardens of the Vatican.
I'm sorry, Steve, you said accommodations, and I immediately thought he was negotiating
no, different,
with the White
different
House on
These are actual accommodations, not accommodations.
Actual accommodations, okay.
In the back garden of the Vatican, the preparations and renovations on those have been in progress since August, just this last summer. And there was also something very strange that happened last year that sort of left a few of us scratching our heads, but we didn't really make much of it, at least I did, and people I know did, which is that we had 2 consistories last year to make new cardinals, which is really, really unusual.
And some of us smart pundits, by the way, I'm not a scholar, but said, oh, that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Showing how smart we are.
It was very strange. The first consistory was in February, is that correct? And there were 20-some cardinals that were made. And then later in the year, in November, right around Thanksgiving, there was a second consistory with only 6 cardinals, which is very unusual. And if anybody mentioned much about it, was that there are no Europeans in this group, and they thought, well, this is maybe sort of the Bertoni machine. Bertoni machine sort of making up for the fact that there were too many Europeans in the last consistory, and so sort of an addendum to the last. What almost everybody missed, or if they noticed they didn't pay much attention to, was the fact that the 6 new cardinals brought the number of cardinal electors up to exactly 120. That's the maximum number of cardinal electors that can be in a conclave. He was topping up, in retrospect now, it seems he was topping up the tank. He wanted it to be sort of the fullest conclave possible, and I think he was probably doing that in preparation for the decision that he ended up announcing on Monday. The practical side of it, too, I think it's worth noting, we all know Pope Benedict is old. He's 85 years old, which these days isn't that spectacular of a number. I mean, he's an old man, but that's not that usual. It's very unusual for popes. He's already one of the oldest popes in history. He was one of the oldest men ever to take the office. In fact, since St. Peter, there has been only one pope, I think, that lived to be 90 years old. Pope Leo XIII lived to be 93, I think. There's never been a pope who lived past 90. All bishops in the world are required to submit their resignation by canon law at the age of 75. Okay? And like we just mentioned, no one under the age of 80 is allowed to vote in the conclave, with certain exceptions that we might actually see coming up. But there are 3 cardinals that will turn 80 after Pope Benedict resigned before Easter. So there may be 80-year-olds voting in the conclave.
So if your birthday happens,
I think, and I have to go back and check. I think in 1996, John Paul II clarified the rule, so that if you turned 80 after the see became vacant, but before the conclave, you could still vote in the next time.
And Steve knew someday these random facts would be of use to someone.
Exactly. There's probably someone here. Yeah. So I think it makes a lot of sense that this is a man who's stepping down for precisely the reasons that he gave. One last thing before I pass on to Mary is that given that he's stepping down, not because he can no longer teach well or write beautifully or give us valuable theological lessons, but because he can't fulfill all of the parts of his office that are required of him, it's unthinkable to me that the cardinals will now go into a conclave and choose someone who is not extremely capable at precisely the things that Pope Benedict is resigning because he feels he can no longer do. They'll pick someone who's younger, almost certainly under the age of 70. That narrows it down to about 50 men. Someone with evangelical vigor, someone hopefully who's a good administrator, you're not going to get a name out of me as to who to look for, mostly because I just recite most of the names and most other people are bouncing around because everyone else is bouncing them around. No one really knows. But
I may have some campaigns going on myself. But.
Kathryn's going to name people she thinks are going to lose so that they will win.
Yes, he knows my strategy.
So I think those 2 points, that his explanation makes a lot of sense, especially in the light of everything that's happened over the last couple of years, that he just doesn't have the strength to carry out his ministry the way he feels it needs to be carried out. And that decision is going to have a big impact on how and who becomes the next one.
So, Mary, are you of the same mind here that this is a good thing? Or are you unsettled?
No, I'll tell you what I think. I think this is a great time to be glad we're not Protestants. It's a great time to be glad we're Catholics. And I mean no disrespect to our Protestant brethren, but you look at some of the turmoil that occurs in other denominations when the person who's in that leadership role steps back. There's a crisis of leadership, a concern over who's the successor, and sometimes there's a personality cult and people wonder, like Billy Graham, who can replace him in terms of influence and in terms of just kind of leading the way for that particular denomination. And we don't have to worry about any of those things. Our succession plan is something that God has given us, so we can have complete trust in that. We don't have to worry that there's a usurper who's going to come along. It's in the hands of the Holy Spirit. And so I find that when I heard the news, I was as shocked as anybody else, but at the same time, I personally didn't feel turmoil. I think where some of this turmoil is coming from is that there are a lot of Catholics who would rather be Protestant right now. They would rather see some doctrinal changes. They would rather see, and those are some of the questions that happen, again, when you've got a replacement of leadership at a high level in some of these other denominations. Is there going to be a turn? Are we going to ordain women to be priests or same-sex? None of that is an issue for us. And again, but there are people within the church who claim to be Catholic, who seem to have, they wish it were so. And so I think there's a lot of kind of stirring up of discussion over things that really are not at issue. The church is not going to change on those matters of truth. And that is the safeguard that we have. And that should bring every one of us peace. But I think it's important to kind of recognize those currents because they come from sort of the far left, the Women's Ordination Conference. You might not even consider them fully in the church, but they call themselves Catholic, agitating for women priests. And so for them, this is a declaration. Are we going to get our women priests? Is there going to be someone? And as my husband said when we were talking about this, he said, well, who on earth do they think is their candidate? Who's going to carry that standard for them? There isn't someone out there who's going to do that. But you have that kind of agitation, but you also have people like Sister Maureen Sullivan from St. Anselm's, who she says, we're in a changing world. Are we going to see someone who's going to respond to them? And by that, she's talking about the usual social issues. And similarly, John Allen, some of you may have read his piece in National Catholic Reporter today. He said, it's deeply improbable that you're going to see someone take ascend to the throne of Peter, who's going to take a different stance on same-sex marriage or contraception or something. But he's still sort of holding out hope that there could be a turn here. We have that certainty of faith. It's a great time to be a Catholic and to watch this unfold and to really place our trust in the power of the Holy Spirit and the institutional church that we've been given.
On one of the on MSNBC on Monday morning, one anchor who was trying to be fair and didn't mean anything about it and is not Catholic, and so he found himself reporting on the Catholic Church, one day ill-equipped, but he said something like, "Well, isn't this a huge distraction from Lent?" And something that Mary said reminded me of this. It's not. It's of course ideological. Some of the drive for changes and whatnot, but there's also the issue of what's the phrase, Steve, that George Weigel uses in evangelical Catholicism for practical atheism. He uses a different phrase.
Oh, for practical atheism, debonair nihilism. There's a
No. It's more of a layman's term than that. Anyhow.
He talks a lot about Catholic life, but I don't think that's what you're...
Yeah, no, that's not the phrase. I had it on the top of my head earlier, but that's all right. But John Paul II and Pope Benedict and George Weigel and whatever phrase he has, and it's just a plug for, this is why you have to go buy his book after this, so you can find out what that phrase is. But he talks about the fact that so many of us walk around saying we're Catholic, but we're not actually Catholic, and some of that in some of those cases is because we are badly catechized. It's ignorance. Sometimes it's willful ignorance, and I think it's willful ignorance if we're not catechizing ourselves and constantly nourishing ourselves. But I think this is a tremendous opportunity because I do think, and this is sort of in keeping with the trailblazing that Father Justin was talking about. But also, it's interesting because critics of the church or people who are looking to reform the church will say, we'll look at him as not a reforming type or being backward or whatever the characterization is. But here, I actually think that he's actually responding to the moment. And I know I've been, and Steve's heard this spiel before, but I've been really frustrated over the last year and probably longer, but so many good things are happening, the new evangelization, the year of faith, the body of catechesis that this Pope has given us, but it's still not penetrating. And I keep joking to friends, like every column I write is about religious freedom. Oh, by the way, they're voting religious liberty, maybe we should care about it. But the fact of the matter is most of America has no idea what's going on. And it's not just an American thing. Obviously we have religious liberty threats around the world, most of them much greater than what we're facing at the moment, but which is why we need to hold the line, because we have that line. But I wonder if part of what the Pope was doing here is saying something bold and radical needs to happen and people need to wake up, and getting the entire world to focus on the Catholic Church at the beginning of Lent might just be that. And I wonder if that is part of it.
Well, it's interesting if you look at it. I was just reading this homily from the Ash Wednesday Mass, from the Mass he celebrated today.
It's just such a moving Mass. I don't know if people got to watch it, but I would commend it to you if you have the opportunity.
Yeah, he's basically made 3 public statements in the past couple of days. The first was on Monday morning announcing this. The second was, although I'm going to get myself in trouble, maybe the homily was the second. I don't remember what time this happened. And he also made it.
He had the audience. Some of us woke up, Father, for the audience at 4 o'clock.
Yeah, the audience.
I had insomnia.
Yeah.
There was the audience this morning, and then the Ash Wednesday Mass.
So he's made 3 references to this, and it's very interesting to read the homily. I just sort of reading through this, I highlighted one of the sections. He basically, it's funny, he connects this very technical phrase of, I'm making this decision in full freedom, and you see that coming out in his exegesis here. He's referring to the readings that have just been proclaimed, and he says, first of all, the Church proposes this the powerful appeal which the prophet Joel addresses to the people of Israel. Thus says the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting and with weeping and with mourning. And then he goes on to say, please note that the phrase with all your heart, which means from the very core of our thoughts and feelings, from the roots in our decisions, choices, and actions, with a gesture of total and radical freedom. You know, and that almost kind of calls to mind the statement he had made just 2 days before, you know, using that canonical language of, I renounce my Petrine ministry with full freedom. You know, so in a sense, I don't know that he intends this to be a distraction from Lent. By the way, there was an interesting editorial in Observatory Romano today, which does reference the fact that apparently he started making this decision a few months ago, right after returning from Mexico and Cuba. So it has sort of come out when this idea started percolating in his head.
I thought it was interesting in his statement, he talked about repeated examinations of conscience.
Yeah.
You know, and for me, I thought this whole thing is just such a fruitful moment to go forward in Lent, because there's so much for each one of us to draw from that. You know, do we examine our conscience with that same level of fidelity, that same level of saying, okay, Lord, I'll give everything up. I'll do whatever you, have I done what you wanted today? What is it you want me to do tomorrow? You know, and that to me was really powerful to see that. And it, in the same, I saw the same homily too, and he, at another point, he said, everyone should ask them, what is the role of God in my life? Is he the Lord or am I? And I concentrate a lot on women's issues and things like that. And there was a video, a documentary that was done about 1.5 years, 2 years ago called Pink Smoke Over the Vatican. And it was done by feminists, and they were sort of telling the story of women who had been marginalized and weren't allowed to be women priests because of misogyny of the church and all these things. And I was struck when I heard and read Benedict's statement. It just the contrast between the sense of entitlement on the one hand of people who are saying, you know, I want this job, I want this ministry, I want to be a priest. And then here's Benedict, Pope Benedict, who's got, you could say, the pinnacle of power, but he doesn't frame things as sort of the feminists do in terms of power and patriarchy. He's the servant of God. And so every day, his question to the Lord is, you know, what do you want of me? And to me, that contrast was just so huge, but so moving, and is something, at least for me personally, to just carry through Lent and through this whole process as we're praying for these cardinals to be open to the Holy Spirit.
I absolutely think that that is the core issue here, and this is going to start sounding like George Weigel is paying us to do plugs for his book, but I actually think the timing is just tremendous. Providential, maybe. George talks about friendship with Christ. You don't have a friendship with Christ if we don't have an intimate relationship with Christ. We're not trying to discern his will in our life every day. Well, then we're not Christian. For Pope Benedict, who's a very personal guy, in his statement it was actually very personal. If you get past the bark of St. Peter, you know, and you realize this is a man telling us about his prayer life, a little window in his prayer life, and I think we've seen that in the subsequent statements.
I think there are a couple of things to be drawn out of this that tell us a lot about how we should understand vocation. The first thing is what you mentioned, this idea of friendship with Christ. My father-in-law is a dentist, and he's my dentist actually. You want to learn to have faith. Have you know, he's a good dentist. And he's studying. I think he became a dentist so he would have a captive audience for evangelizing. And I say that only jokingly, about halfway. He's studying to become a deacon right now. But he told me that he had this sort of reconversion when he was a young man. He was raised Catholic, nominally. But he said one of the things that struck him about the people he met and sort of bringing him back to living a vibrant faith is, he said, what struck him was that they talked about Jesus and Mary as if they were real people. And that phrase, as if they were real people, really resonated with me. It's very easy for us in today's world, and I think especially for Catholics because of our great intellectual tradition, to over-intellectualize the faith, to turn it into a set of ideas and propositions that aren't personal in the exact sense of that word. Our faith is about a person. He has a name, Jesus. He is the second person of the Holy Trinity. He came to
walked the earth.
He walked the earth. And this guy who he got into arguments with, you know, and ate with was made into the first pope, and that's, you know, it's his success that we're talking about today. This is very concrete. Ours is a very earthy religion. So the first aspect of this has to do with vocation is that our vocation, our universal vocation, by virtue of our baptism, is to become closer to Jesus Christ. And I think you see that, as you said, these last statements have been last few days have been very personal. So personally revealing about sort of the Pope's her life. But I think anyone who's read a lot of his stuff sees that too. He's not just a clear teacher, but it's clear from reading anything he's written that this is a man who's deeply in love with Jesus Christ and his church. And that is the source of everything that he says. I think of this, for those of us who, we often talk about vocation as something that if you are called to be a priest or a religious sister, that you discern one time.
Right.
And that's a really bad way to view vocation. We all have vocation, the universal call to holiness. We're all called to holiness, first and foremost. But even
actual sainthood.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But even when we talk about our particular vocations, whether it's to the priesthood or to the married life, whatever, discerning that vocation doesn't end when you decide to join the seminary, right? Or even when you're ordained or when you get married. Those sacraments are instruments to help us live out our primary vocation, which is to be saints. And the vocational discernment doesn't end when you know what you're called to be. Pope Benedict is still discerning how to live out his vocation. This is a man who was ordained, what, in the early 1950s?
And was writing letters to Jesus when he was 7 or 8.
Yeah, and so here's a man who knew since shortly after the end of World War II that he wanted to be a priest, was ordained, and he is still on his knees daily. I don't know if he's physically gets on his knees, he's getting kind of old now, but who's still trying to discern what God is asking of him in his vocation. I think that's really important to all of us, and especially to young people. I mean, a lot of young people try to figure out what does God want me to do, and when is He going to tell me? Because I'm rather anxious to find out.
Right.
Do what you are doing now as well as you can, and make sure that you're in a disposition, in a posture to be receptive to God's will for you, and that never ends. That's something we all have to work on always.
And I think maybe part of the answer to the question is what's different between 2010 when he said I can't obviously step down now, and now is God revealed something to him between those times, and yeah, I think that's particularly instructive. Father, a couple of people have said to me, and maybe written on the National Review Online today, that they're particularly bothered because of the vocation thing, and because it's like he's the Holy Father, and now he's walking away from that. It's not a job, you know. And so even in some of our language, we're talking about stepping aside or stepping down, resigning, and resigning isn't really the word.
Yeah.
How do people reconcile the Holy Father not being the Holy Father anymore?
I don't know. I don't. You know, it's interesting. A couple days ago, a priest who was ordained prior to the Second Vatican Council was telling me a little bit about what it was like to be a priest in 1955. And he said, you know, in those days, priests never retired. He said, but the difference was, you know, you were the pastor, you were 90 years old, you basically woke up, said Mass, and then went back to sleep, you know? And what happened was there were, you know, he wasn't being nasty, he was just saying that the reality was there were 3 or 4 associates who basically ran the parish, and the pastor was the figurehead. And that was okay. And I think to some extent, you know, back in 1500, you could have the Pope doing something like that. You know, you have some protonotary apostolic rubber stamping the documents and so forth. The reality is that you can't have that now. In a 24-hour news cycle, you can't have a Pope who clearly has surrogates doing everything. Right. You know, we've come to be used to a Pope who is fully engaged nearly up to the moment of his death. And I think perhaps, you know, the way I reconcile this is to say, well, you know, Pope Benedict has said, I can't do that. I can't do that, you know, and it would be unfair for me to cling to this office out of my own desire rather than to allow the Church to select somebody who could do that. So as I said before, I see this as sort of a selfless act.
Yeah. And it's not just the desire, not just out of a desire to cling to power, I think, but I'm sure there's a great desire for him not to appear weak.
Exactly. Yes.
And not to dispirit people by looking like he's giving up. You know, one of my favorite quotes from the pontificate of Pope John Paul II, I'm not sure when he said this, or even if he did say it, it may be apocryphal, but so someone asked him about the possibility of abdication. He said, fathers don't abdicate. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. And then, since we've had our obligatory shot at the National Catholic Register, or reporter, sorry. National Catholic Register is fantastic. National Catholic
The official apology has gone out.
Michael Sean Winters, earlier today, I think, had some comment. Ralph Stothard had made some comment about, to the effect that this is like being a father, you don't give up. And Michael Sean Winters said, that's just true. And he said, my dad is still alive, and he's still my father, and he always will be. But he doesn't make my lunch in the morning, he doesn't drive me to school, he doesn't pay the bills, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. You mentioned the word figurehead. There was a time when the papacy demanded a lot less of the man who held that office. That's not the case anymore. I think I said it the other night when we were together. The Pope is not a figurehead. He's an apostle. He's not just a manager, he's a messenger. By realizing that this is what the papacy demands in this news cycle, I think the Pope is stepping down. And I wouldn't be surprised in this day and age when people live a lot longer than they used to, if he is starting something of a trend. I hope it doesn't become sort of a habitual thing, but I wouldn't be surprised if over the next couple centuries, that popes, when they reach an age where they feel they can't sort of keep up anymore, they will abdicate or resign, whatever word it is that we're using. I wouldn't be, it's been 600 years since this last happened, I wouldn't be surprised if it happened again in the next 100 years.
I wondered too if he's teaching us something, you know, obviously John Paul II, we watched him suffer, and we suffered with him, and we watched him die. I wonder if he's teaching us here something about the value of human life when you're not the most powerful man in the world anymore, you know? I mean, I think we have a hard time, people do live longer, and faculties fail, or whatever it is, or they step aside from something because or they're not playing the same role that they used to play. But I mean, I looked at him this morning at the audience, and I don't think I've ever seen him so peaceful. But he was such, I took him as such a father figure, trying to comfort all those people who were packing the audience hall, who were sad to see him go, who wanted to express their love for him. And what I sort of took out of that is, Father's going nowhere. He's going to be actually focused praying for us and this moment in the church, and it might actually be more powerful, more powerful than him having to worry about what is going on with the ATMs at the Vatican. So that, I think that might be a very powerful
I think that was something that struck me too. You know, sort of glossed over. Okay, what's he going to do now? But the fact that
nothing, which is prayer, not exactly nothing.
Retiring, just praying.
Just praying.
But to have our spiritual father spend the rest of his life with this incredible knowledge, and he's carried the burden of the church. But to take that to prayer, he's going to be praying like nobody else. But
right.
What does that also do? To me, that really elevates that call to prayer, and even just heightens our awareness of those in the church who have that vocation to pray, whether it's the cloistered who are praying, or the moms at home who are praying as they're doing their whatever it is. To me, that was another powerful thing, that we can't look at this with the world's eyes of the power, the influence, the things that he can do. It's so much deeper than that.
Right.
And thank God he sees that.
And he's getting us to focus on that. It's not like we use the word cloister on a regular basis in news stories, and here we are. What is that? There are people who do that? Oh, not just this old ex-pope, or however they're going to describe them.
Yeah. I don't know if anybody here knows this. I don't know if anybody in the world knows this. How will, as Charles Krauthammer asked you the other day, what do you call him on March 1st?
I think I told Charles Joe.
Joe, I think.
Yeah, I was going to call him Uncle Joe.
I mean, he'll still be a bishop, but there's not, to my mind, there's not.
Well, I know in La Stampa, in the Italian newspaper La Stampa, they interviewed someone who seem to have a pretty good knowledge of canon law, so I presume perhaps they are a canon lawyer. Who knows?
No, if somebody calls me and they don't have a canon lawyer, sometimes I might give the impression I know something.
Yeah.
I did take one canon law class.
Well, and they implied that he would go back to being a cardinal. That was the conclusion at the end of the article, is that he would retain the office of cardinal. Perhaps, who knows? I mean, there's not a lot of examples of this. I mean, one of the previous guys to have done this, was it Pope Celestine, was thrown in prison after he abdicated. His successor threw him in prison. So we don't have a lot to go on here.
I'm predicting that doesn't happen.
I don't think that's what's going to happen either. But
He was really close.
yeah, he was
Very extremely cloistered.
Of course, St. John of the Cross, spent some time in prison as well. His brother's in prison as well.
There's a good precedent for.
Yeah, I was going to say there's an apostolic precedent for that too. Beyond
Peter.
We'll leave that one where it lies.
In Rome too.
You being our apostle expert. So Stephen, Cardinal Dolan's going to be Pope, right?
That's right.
That's what all the Americans say.
They say the
cardinal
conventional wisdom on this is always wrong, and the conventional wisdom in this case is that you can't have an American Pope. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and a lot of good reasons for that. The United States is right now the only world superpower, and there's a lot to be said for not having us control yet one more thing. But that doesn't bother me.
Excuse me, you're talking about the Bishop of New York. I'm from New York, so it's perfect.
If it's not Cardinal Dolan, I'd like to see, and I really don't think it will be him.
Yeah, no,
but it would be nice to see sort of Cardinal Dolan minus the U.S. passport. Someone with that kind of, someone who's extremely sharp, media savvy. If you've seen Cardinal Dolan on TV, you know he has a sort of Midwestern charm. He's very charismatic and genial and warm. I mean, if you're ever in a room with him, he's always hugging people and giving them big, firm handshakes. And he's an incredibly sharp man. This is a man who has a doctorate in church history. He's not just sort of a friendly face and a warm smile.
He has also got a remarkable depth of prayer, which I don't think people appreciate because of
he has a lot of
personality.
qualities. Sort of what makes him good in front of the cameras are a lot of other qualities that most people don't see.
Right, remarkable pastoral.
Skill. So someone like that would be ideal. Who fits that bill? I don't know. One of the things that we haven't talked about a lot is some of the not so spectacular parts of this pontificate that's coming to an end. It's widely recognized that the Roman Curia is in sort of this disarray and a mess. I'm not a Vaticanologist. I don't know all of the specifics of that, but and whether that's sort of the fact that Pope Benedict isn't a great manager, or whether he delegated to people who weren't up to the task or whatever. There's going to be a lot of work to be done to sort of pull the Curia out of disarray. And you know, again, I said it earlier, I'll say it again. Someone who's young, it's not just popes who get worn out by their large, big responsibilities. Anybody watched the State of the Union last night, you saw all the gray hairs on President Obama's head. People with great responsibilities suffer physical consequences from this. You saw with former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton now too. You get beaten down. I mean, you have a lot of responsibilities, a lot of travel, terrible hours. So that we're looking for someone who's up to that task. Only sort of not just with national security consequences, but with eternal consequences. So it's going to have to be someone who's physically and of course also spiritually and intellectually up to the task. So, any volunteers?
Well, and of course, Cardinal Marc Ouellet from Quebec.
The prefect for the Congregation for Bishops now. Yeah.
His name keeps coming up, and if you look at it on paper, well, he makes a lot of sense, because as head of the Congregation for Bishops, he's sort of seen the best and the worst. He knows the Curia. I think he sends a statement about transitioning out of, obviously we know the awful things that have happened and the mismanagement and worse, and having a handle on the bishops, and some of the appointments recently have been fantastic, and he's played a role in that. So he makes a lot of sense in that sense. And in addition to that, I was at a conference on the Church in the Americas in December in the Vatican, and he presided over it. And besides having such skill with languages, I think he speaks 5 or 6 languages, he also has an uncanny resemblance to John Paul II. So much so that I was behind him one day and I noticed, wait, that's not JP2? And I grabbed something and said, see, he looks like John Paul II. But, so he has the look down, the papal look down. but he also, by all accounts, is a holy man. And that, of course, is the real prerequisite for who should be Pope.
The question is, will enough cardinals realize that Canada is not part of America?
Well, and I gather there are some, French issues with Canada and things like that. But I would hope that the conflict of such things. What encourages you the most about this all, and maybe what worries you the most as well?
The last line of Matthew's Gospel. I will be with you until the end of the age. It's easy to get frustrated by the world we live in. As someone said, so often I kind of sort of cheesy sayings that make so much sense that I have to then repeat them and have the embarrassment of repeating cheesy sayings. But this one, there's a lot of truth to it. We're an Easter people living in a Good Friday world, so we get to fight all the battles, but we have the confidence that it's been won. So that's the ultimate source of conflict, I guess.
Well, and there is something, we are radically countercultural if we're really living Christianity. And when you think of our celebrity culture, I mean, there's something about that cult of character that doesn't actually exist here. And if we are overly upset about it, maybe we need to, getting back to what you were talking about before, Mary, we've got to re-examine the order of things here a little bit. Because yes, he's our Holy Father that the Lord has given us for this moment, but maybe the Lord needs us to have someone else.
One thing that struck me in terms of just the timing was, it just gave me a little bit of pause in this sense. I thought, he's clearly so sharp intellectually. He's writing brilliant things about the major issues, the life issues, the human dignity of the person, things like that, or dignity of the human person.
And so timely too, talking about religious liberty and threats here.
But if he feels he's not up to it, part of me was saying, whoa, what's coming, And part of it, I again sort of look at things through the woman lens and what's going on in terms of life issues and things like that. And you look at the billions of dollars being poured into contraception and abortion, especially towards the third world. And I was struck by the fact that yet in Africa, they still value fertility. They still value family more so than in the West. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I thought was, well, maybe in God's plan, maybe there needs to be someone vigorous enough to be able to travel, especially, and to be a voice to that part of the world. I don't know, I can't explain what God did, but it did strike me that this is such a pivotal point.
Yeah.
God is choosing someone else. There's a huge task ahead, and they will need many, many prayers.
Right.
I'm not worried at all by the fact that he's decided to step down. My only worry is that people will use this as a cheap shot. And as we talked about before, sort of saying, look at this guy's thrown in the towel, and that people who disagreed with some of the things that he did would kind of, cheaply use this as a cheap shot. Now, what gives me courage, Stephen has already said, but one thing I hope for is maybe this means we'll get some more great scholarship that comes out of these post-papal years. Maybe there will be this great treasure trove that we uncover, when the Lord calls it home, and who knows.
And there's so much too he's already given us that we still haven't quite processed. Most of us haven't read. And I think that's important. On the point that Mary just made, I am in October. I don't usually hang out in Rome a lot, but it's sounding like I do right now. But so in October, I went over and got to meet the Pope, and he handed me this message to all the women throughout the world, and it was the same message that Paul VI had delivered after the Second Vatican Council. He had delivered different messages to different people, the sick and workers and scientists and artists and women. but very specifically, it talks about Catholic and non-Catholic throughout the world, specific gifts that women have, and the world needs you to help hold back the reckless hand of technology, and to bring peace to the world. And it's really just a beautiful, you can find it online, it's just a beautiful statement about what the Catholic Church actually believes about women and their unique gifts. And I think you're onto something, Mary, because when he was doing it, I thought it was profound. I thought he was saying, maybe we didn't communicate this, and maybe you didn't receive this, and we've got to try this again. But I also, and maybe I'm reading all too much into it now, in hindsight, but surrounding it, I sort of got the sense that this wasn't going to fully do it. And again, getting back to my something bold needed to happen. Maybe this is it. Maybe he doesn't know who it's going to be, but somebody very different can deliver this message that he started to reboot or refresh or renew.
Yeah, because everything he said is so fantastic.
Right.
But
right.
yet,
not everyone's hearing it.
Not everyone's hearing it. The
yeah.
traction's not there, and maybe that's going to be the next Pope's task, to bring to life and be the spokesperson, the leader.
Right. And we're going to take questions in a second. I just want to exploit my one people meeting one more time. And Steve has heard the story, but I just think it's everything. So you get a little time to talk to the Pope, not long at all. But my prepared line was to thank him for Jesus of Nazareth, the books he's written, and he gave me this look and this smile and this nod, as if to say, yes. It's about Jesus. You understand. This is not about me. This is not, and I think that's the message. I mean, that's the message of the papacy, his papacy. That's the message of this move. It's all about Jesus. And he, at this conference in December, he talked to people in the Americas, and he kept going back to, we were talking about friendship with Christ before, encounter with Christ. And it was almost like, I was actually a little taken aback. Not because it was wrong or anything, but I expected him to say something nice and encouraging, and there was an urgency about it where he was almost admonishing us. There was sort of Catholic leaders from the Americas, and he was saying, if you are not encountering Christ every day and purifying, being pure and going to Christ and being sanctified, well, every little nice evangelization plan in the world is not going to convert the world. And so yeah, I mean, I think that's the message he's trying to drive home here.
If there's no cross, it's not evangelization.
Yeah, right.
If it's not there, it's not.
Yeah, and we talk a lot in the new evangelization talks. We talk a lot about joy, but
they go hand in hand.
Sorry?
They go hand in hand.
Yeah, right, and maybe there is something so...
That's the contradiction that the world doesn't get.
That's right.
Is that they either see the Catholics talking about suffering and see the Catholics sort of clapping their hands. Joy. They don't see that those two things come from the same source.
Right. It's like the misunderstanding Cardinal Dolan or not fully getting him. Oh, he's this joyful guy.
Right.
But there's more to it.
Yeah.
No, and maybe there is something, as you were saying, Stephen, before, to this timing. Here we are, having to focus on Ash Wednesday.
Yeah.
Here we are, and taking us through to Easter. Father, did you want to say?
Well, no, I was just going to say that the joy and suffering thing, that was Father Robert Barron's rather provocative thing in his DVD series. He's looking at this Grunewald Eisenheim altarpiece, and he says, there's a picture of a happy man, and there's a contorted figure dead on a cross. It's this just strikingly provocative idea, but yeah, I think you're right. But when you figure out that mixture of joy and suffering, when you figure that out, let me know, because I really am still working on that one. So.
Well, there was something something symbolic or about even today. So it was Ash Wednesday, but it was so the audience today was so joyful. People wanted to show their gratitude to the Pope, and he was so full of love and joy. And even in there, you saw the paradox playing out a little bit, I think. But does anybody have any questions?
I guess this is a comment. I guess if I find it interesting, I guess I'm not buying the whole this was planned months in advance, because Lombardi tells us in November for 6 months that we'll have an encyclical, in 2013, year of faith, And so I'm not so sure. It does seem a bit, perhaps this was coming, it does seem a bit rushed. Why now? Why not October, November, et cetera? So I wonder, I feel like I'm missing something there, quite
Well,
honestly.
no, I think that, I mean, what I've been hearing and reading, and I think it's not so much a matter of, well, the Pope decided, and on Ash Wednesday, you know, within 3 days before Ash Wednesday, I will do. But I think it's been a continual discernment process.
Yeah, I think the decision to do it, the final decision to do it, and we're speculating, nobody knows for sure except for the Pope. But the final decision to do it was probably made more recently. But I think the idea has been with him. It's something he's been pondering over and praying over and discerning for a long time. And so a lot of the preparations for it have been were put in place even before he decided whether or not this was something he was.
And maybe there was some other plan for the cloister they're working
Yeah,
on. You know,
yeah.
A couple of alternatives. I don't know.
So it's not that he decided 6 months ago or last summer that he was going to retire now or resign now. But I think the idea has been in his head for a long time. When the exact decision was made.
That's good leadership. You know, a good leader is there, even as you're weighing over things. You know, you're trying to take care of the contingencies.
Yeah, and why now as opposed to October? I suspect, among other things, that the fact that this is the start of the Lenten season probably has something to do with it. Like I said, someone else pointed this out, but it's almost certain that the church will have a new pope by Easter. That's a significant thing. So.
When I was actually going to ask a question, my actual question was, do you think this is, do you think we're kind of undervaluing how huge of an event this is in human history and church history? When we look back at this event and be the defining event of Catholic Church and age, like how it changes the papacy. I mean, I think it's interesting to me that Joseph Ratzinger is going to go to the grave Joseph Ratzinger. I think that strikes me very profoundly. It seems to humanize for me like the opposite of papacy in a way that we haven't seen.
Well, I think that's interesting. And I mentioned this somewhere. It might have been on National Review for you guys. Joseph Ratzinger is a priest by his ordination. He's a Christian by his baptism. He's a pope by election, and he will cease being a pope by choice. The pope is not a vocation the way the other vocations are. I'm not saying it's not a vocation. It's not a vocation the way the other ones are. And it's not a sacrament. So I think that what you said, this seems to humanize him in a way. I think that's true. I think there's a great deal of truth to that. I think that this is a humanizing act in a lot of ways.
And I think in terms of its historic significance, I go back to George Weigel's book, and I point to you guys because you work with him at the public policy, and he's actually over in Rome, wherever Rome is. I point in the right direction if I knew.
All roads lead to Rome.
Oh, okay. So any direction is fine. But he talks about this hinge moment in history where we have some serious choices to make. Are we really going to be Catholic or not? You know, and I think we're going to look back, and I hope if we make the right choices. I mean, his focus on prayer here, his focus on the examined life, I think that's a challenge to us. And like I said, if you go back, it's on the Knights of Columbus site, it's on the Vatican site, and it was around December 11th, he spoke to people from North and South America, and he was admonishing us, you know, be Catholic, people, you know, or stop saying you're Catholic, as Mary was intimating. Yeah, no, I think it's going to be, we're going to realize the huge significance of this.
I've yet to see a left-leaning journalist demand that Jews eat bacon. So I'm wondering, what I'm reading a lot of is sort of cynical anticipation that the next pope will quote-unquote get it right on a lot of liberal issues. So where is that coming from? That's what I want to know. Where is this sort of cynical anticipation that the next pope will violate church teaching left and right?
Cynicism.
Well, it's cynicism, and also, I mean, isn't the Catholic Church the last bastion,
standing,
the last obstacle?
Holding on to the truth. You know, we haven't caved, so to speak, on so many of these.
At least institutionally, we have.
Right. Yeah, and I think
a lot of us have caved.
I think some of it, sometimes it's malice towards the church. I think more often than not, and maybe I'm being too nice about this. More often than not.
You said malice. I don't think that's too nice.
No, but more often than not, it's ignorance. I mean, living a truly Christian life is countercultural. In a way, It's not that suddenly, you know, we talk about these reforms, and George's new book about evangelical Catholicism. It's not that suddenly, starting with Leo XIII during the 20th century, being Catholic meant that you had to be sort of have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That's always been the case. It's just we now live in a culture in where that is countercultural. The surrounding culture doesn't reinforce that way of life. It contradicts that way of life. So being a faithful Catholic today, in a sense, is the same as it's always been. But it manifests itself in ways that contradict the culture around it. So I think a lot of the questions, sort of cynicism and skepticism towards the church, come from people whose sort of presuppositions about the reality in which we live are just manifestly different than the way we see the world as Catholics.
And so often, isn't that because, I mean, we were educated in institutions, sometimes they were Catholic institutions that didn't talk about the integrated life.
One of the best sort of, one of the most acute diagnoses of this secularism comes from Pope Benedict XVI. I think nobody has done a better job of articulating precisely what it is about the ambient culture, especially in the West, where the church is facing is declining in a way that's not in other places like Africa. Is this idea that it's hard to convince people of the truth of Jesus Christ if people don't believe in truth, okay? Or don't believe that my truth and your truth have anything to do with each other. And what he has done, I talked about this in a piece I had yesterday at Huffington Post, of all places, is that if we have no common ground, no truth on which we can agree, that's a false that leads to a false idea of tolerance. Because what happens is that, you know, if there's no truth in the world, the result is not an end of conflict. It's the impossibility of reconciliation. If we say that my reality and your reality have nothing intrinsically in common, then there is no common ground. And it's just your will against my will. And one of us is winning and the other one is losing. That's a very scary situation. I think that's the sort of the self-cannibalizing road that this secular culture is heading towards. That's why it's a culture of death and a dictatorship of relativism. Those two things are describing the same phenomenon in a lot of ways. People, even good and decent people, that's their worldview a lot of times. And so if you start from that worldview, not realizing the contradictions or not being sort of startled out of it, if you look at the Catholic Church, you're going to see a weird thing that doesn't make sense.
Well, one thing I was heartened by was yesterday I was hanging out a little bit with Rick Warren, who was in town, the evangelical pastor, and he was, and not even, it sounded like it was part of his shtick, it wasn't, he was particularly focused on Pope Benedict that day. He was talking about the dictatorship of relativism, and I was really heartened by it because not only was this a non-Catholic who is, who's been an ally with us in so many things in terms of an anti-secular worldview, but it reminded me so much of when Pope John Paul II died. My inbox was filled with press releases from evangelical congressmen who just loved, I mean, they were just so effusive about John Paul II because of the life issues, and they talked about the culture of life and the culture of death, and I think we undervalue what Benedict has given us in terms of understanding the secular threat and the secular threat within, which I think is what we really undervalue. We should take one question from this side. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for being here, guys. And
thank you.
My question has to do with the nature of paradox and contradiction, and we've kind of touched on it, but I was...
The easy questions, thanks.
Right. A coworker, a well-meaning coworker of mine, asked me yesterday, what do you make of the way that John Paul II, in a way, clung to his papacy through illness, and then what is perceived as Benedict XVI kind of jettisoning his papacy in the face of illness, and how do you reconcile? How ought we reconcile these two different papacies, where John Paul, you know, his final encyclical was his suffering, and illustrating the dignity of the human person, and Benedict, who clearly is facing, you know, illnesses of various kinds, you know, advocating his papacy. I mean, I think these are obviously two different men and two different ministries, but is there, and I'm sure we'll see much more of this as time goes on and reconcile, but how can we at this point in a way, how can we reconcile this seeming paradox?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, and to add fuel to the fire, I mean, it's always good to introduce the elephant that's in the room. You know, there was a provocative, well, maybe not provocative. There was a comment made by Cardinal Jeevich, which people interpreted as saying precisely what you said, which was something to the effect of, you know, the Pope John Paul II knew that he couldn't climb down from the cross, and many people interpreted that as a kind of a negative comment towards Benedict XVI. But, you know, at the same point in time, you know, we were talking about discernment before,
Right.
you know, and I think that's the problem. What's the paradox? The paradox is that there isn't a formula, you know, discernment. You know, there are as many, you know, just as the Second Vatican Council calls all of us to holiness, there are as many paths to holiness as there are people. And there are certain formulas, you know, the commandments are a good starting point, the sacraments are helpful in this respect. But, you know, in terms of individual vocation, there are 6 billion individual vocations out there. You know, discernment is essential. And so I think that the answer is that there isn't a formula. If you're a pope and you are sick, you do X.
Right.
I think that
There's
may
no rule
be,
book out
I
there.
think that may be, that's how I reconcile it.
And I mean, my first thought was that, I mean, 2 different men, 2 different calls. John Paul II clearly was showing us suffering and death and how to do that with faith and trust and surrender. And maybe Pope Benedict's call is that he's teaching us how to accept limitations and discern what you do with that, and that may be how you reconcile it.
And I think the other thing is that Benedict in his comments stressed that the head of our church is Jesus Christ. And I think that's something to draw people back to. This isn't about a personality. And it's Pope Benedict's response to what God has asked of him in that role. But it's the Lord Jesus Christ who's the head of our church. You know, so however God chooses to do that, that's the docility that's called
And he
for.
manifested the greatest act through weakness, precisely through the cross. And Father, check my theology on this, but I think the last time I looked at the Bible, it was that power is made perfect in weakness. So to the world, it's this. I didn't like it when I saw it. It was like, you know, we're backing down. We're, you know, it opens Pandora's box for all these questions and speculation of the relevancy of Catholicism in today's world. But I think, you know, it struck me while I was listening to you, all of you, you know, that this is a sign of contradiction to the world. The weakness, so to speak, that Benedict is actually, in some paradoxical, mysterious way, the power that is the Catholic Church.
It's also, someone else said this before I did, and I can't remember who said it. So you Google it and give them the credit. But there are aspects there are things about the cross that we can learn from watching Pope Benedict's pontificate come to an end, and there are things about the truth of the cross that we learn from watching John Paul II end his life come to an end. And some of those things are sort of would have been impossible for one man to show at the same time. I mean, you can't show the dignity of the human life and accepting whatever suffering comes at the moment of death. That's when your ministry ends. That we saw with John Paul II, and at the same time learn the lessons that we see from Pope Benedict about how this ministry is bigger than me. That the pontificate is not about Joe Ratzinger. It's about the church in which the ministry serves. So there are different facets of what the Pope is and what redemptive suffering means, and you can't always learn them all in the same life.
I'd like to add a word of caution, and then this is the other elephant that's in the room that hasn't really come up, which is the whole conspiracy theory thing. You know, is there really some big scandal lurking in the background or whatever? And I'd like to just sort of add a word of caution to anyone. You know, conspiracy theories are always very dangerous for the following reason. They're inherently solipsistic, they're self-contained, they're self-enclosed. Once you get into one, there's no way out of it, because anyone who's in power, who would be in the position to say this is true or this is false, well, if they deny the conspiracy, then they're in on it, so to speak. You know, and so once you get into that, you're stuck. you can only prove them true, you can't prove them false, you know? And so I think for us, there can be this temptation to say, oh, when's the other shoe going to drop? And I suspect there is no other shoe to drop.
And I mean, I think anyone who's been watching him over the last couple of years, you can see it physically. I mean, how much this drains him. I think it's transparent. I think he's been transparent with us. And I mean, again, if you go back into the Seawall book, I mean, he's very, very open about for a quiet guy who doesn't want to talk about himself. He's actually very transparent about these things, and so it just seems all so obvious that it's take it at face value. Well, thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming. I want to thank also all of you for contributing to the discussion. Kathryn, Mary, Stephen, Father Justin, this has been excellent. On that end note with our Holy Father and his fatigue that we've all seen, my husband and I went to the wedding blessing in Rome, and just sitting there for a Wednesday audience, any one of you who have done that, you see, my goodness, this is his week. This is a weekly occurrence, an event with thousands of people that you think, you know, most organizations would take a year or more just preparing for, but he has it on a weekly basis, and just so thankful for all that he's given us. So I hope, you know, given this discussion, I hope it helps all of us to keep our Holy Father in prayer, and we hope you'll come back to the CIC throughout Lent. We have our Lord right here this whole time. He's not behind, but he's with us here. So
Was he shaking his head at all when we were talking?
From 1 to 4, 1 to 4, we have adoration.
I just learned that today.
Yes, very, very valuable here, downtown, heart of downtown Washington. It's been called the closest tabernacle to the White House, and
because it is.
Indeed it is. Yes, indeed it is. So we hope that you'll join us again throughout this journey of Lent toward Easter. And please join me.
And buy some books.
Oh yes, we have all these books that have been mentioned throughout the discussion. I'm so glad you all are well read, and I hope you all will appreciate our bookstore as well. So please join me in thanking our speakers.